Being hacked, even just the threat of a cyber attack, is enough to keep companies and customers up at night. Take, for example, the Bank of England, where a new internal watchdog report has identified cyber attacks as a major risk that could lead to the demise of the institution. And on this side of the Atlantic, a new U.S. State Department report that says the government needs to overhaul its strategies for stopping cyber attacks. That's coupled with concerns that U.S. elections are increasingly at risk in the current primaries and ahead of November's midterm elections. For more on this and the state of cybersecurity around the world, I want to get to Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde in London with a special guest. Caroline?
Yeah, special guest, Emily, is none other than George Kurtz. He is the CEO of CrowdStrike, which is helping analyse all these threats that, whether it's governments, whether it's electoral systems, indeed whether it's banks that are exposed. Talk to us first about US elections, the midterms, November. What sort of threats are you seeing ahead of that, and where are the actors coming from?
Well, when we think about the electoral process, they're highly targeted from actors around the globe. Whether it's any of the major countries, certainly Russia's been active in the past. And I think what most people need to be concerned about is protecting that process and making sure that the results aren't skewed, whether it's electronic results or whether it's even kind of skewing what people think about the electoral process and who they're voting for. And we've seen a lot of that in the past. And
so how does a company like CrowdStrike get employed? Are you hearing more from governments, for example, in particular from the US in terms ahead of the elections? Is this a new area of demand or not so much?
I think a lot of governments are well aware of the problem now, and they're certainly trying to take precautions.
What precautions can they take?
Well, you know, when you think about the process, there's two areas. One is the voting machines themselves. Some obviously are paper ballots, but a lot of the voting is going to electronic voting, so making sure that's protected, as well as just kind of the reconnaissance of what's happening behind the scenes and making sure that the election process is fair and it's not influenced one way or another.
Reconnaissance. Talk to us about reconnaissance. I mean, talk to us about what it is that CrowdStrike just does to be able to alert to any sort of anomaly, because you're sifting through, what, 100 billion bits of data?
Yeah, we actually collect 100 billion discrete events per day. And in the span of 2 days, we handle more events than Twitter has tweets in a year. So it's a massive amount of data that we have to sift through. And ultimately, what we're doing using machine learning and artificial intelligence is trying to find the bad stuff before people even know that it's actually bad, which ultimately protects our customers from breaches.
How many breaches would one see, or how many bits of bad would you see per day?
Well, we see 100 million events. We see millions of bad things that happen, and on average, we stop about 3 breaches per hour. And that's kind of the distillation of what we do. But there's a lot more malware that we block and lots of events that happen. But at the end of the day, customers are really trying to prevent against those breaches.
And where are the banks, for example? We're talking about the Bank of England here in the UK, saying, look, we are trying to track banks at the moment about their openness to cyber attacks and the demise that we would see. Where are the threats coming from? Are they individuals? Are they state-sponsored? What are corporates such as banks having to look for at the moment?
Well, I think when you look at banks, they're obviously highly targeted just because that's where the money's at. Yep. And whether it's e-crime, whether it's nation state, whether it's even North Korea has been targeting some of the bank and the banking system. Well, when you can't get money in and out of the country, if you can basically get it from ransomware and other means, it's a way to fund some of the efforts. So.
Is it easy to distinguish when it is a nation state or just a lone actor who happens to be based in North Korea?
It's actually really hard now. The lines are blurring. It used to be more well-defined of nation state actors, how they actually operate and what they do in e-crime. And, even the e-crime actors now are taking some of the weaponry, if you will, the vulnerabilities that have been disclosed by governments, weaponizing that and delivering that as ransomware.
So is ransomware, that's been such a hot talking point, is that the main area that I need to be as an individual wary of, or corporates need to be wary of? What are the key threats that you're seeing, and how are they changing throughout the course of 2018?
Well, there's certainly the financial threat, whether that's getting your credentials compromised and having someone log into your bank account. That's one area we see a lot of what we call business email compromises, which
Phishing.
is, it's kind of a fake email. It looks like it came from the CEO to the CFO saying wire money. And then we see ransomware where, obviously in Europe and UK and other places and the US, lots of big companies have been hit by that and knocked offline for many weeks at a time. I mean, massive amount, millions and millions of pounds of damage from ransomware.
What's interesting is in the UK and EU-wide more broadly, we've seen tougher regulation come in about when one experiences a breach. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, saying, look, you've got to alert your users within 72 hours. How reasonable is it to expect that a company can be alerted, can know, and can quickly ensure that they've alerted the regulators?
Well, if they can instrument their endpoints and they have good visibility, they can identify that very quickly, and that's going to be really an important concept because that's where the action's at, their computers, their desktops, and their servers, and things that work in the cloud. So that can be done with the right technology, but I think what's going to be interesting there is when we think about ransomware, I mean, you have a massive fine, 4% of revenue, and then you have e-crime on the other end saying, well, what if I basically charge a company £5 million instead of them paying a £50 million fine? Will they do it, right? And I think there's going to be some interesting examples of companies being tested to not disclose information when that happens.
Wow, that's going to be a tough one for them to contend with. What about infrastructure hacking as well? We were just, you mentioned North Korea earlier about how they're going for the banks, for example. Sure. They're also going for infrastructure. You said you've noted it in the United States. How do you end up knowing that it's North Korea behind it? And what are they wanting to do with, is it just disruption that they want to cause? Is it power that they want to cause? Well, what is it?
Well, any of the nation state actors have various motivations. First is information gathering, which is obvious. The second one is maintaining a strategic advantage if there was a conflict. So being able to implant malware, as an example, that they could activate that would actually disrupt those critical infrastructure systems. So that's basically why they're doing it. In terms of how hard it is to figure out who's who, as I said earlier, it's becoming more and more difficult to figure out, you know, is it nation state, is it e-crime, who is it? There's various means of looking at infrastructure and malware and the delivery mechanism to try to associate who's doing what, but it's more of, you know, it's part art and part science.
We'll see you get that balancing act going forward. Art and science, it seems. George Kurtz, CEO of CrowdStrike, making art a science and science an art, potentially.